Are you tired of not being able to convert up in exchange? In today's video, we'll discuss various rook versus bishop and knight endgames. We'll talk about when the position is a draw or when the side with the rook is winning. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. Okay, let's start by discussing rook versus bishop endgames. And in this endgame, if you're on the defending side, meaning that if you're the side that has the bishop, you want to run to the opposite color corner of this bishop right here. So in this position, black has a dark square bishop. That means that black wants to run to the light square corner. If black runs to the dark square corner and it accidentally gets stuck over there, the position is going to be lost. So what you want to do is to run to the light square corner because you have the dark square bishop. Of course, you don't want to lose the bishop. You want to bring the bishop with you, just like what I'm about to show you right now. You will slowly advance to the corner and then you will get into a situation like this. Now, here you need to be very careful because white will still try to checkmate you. White will go rook to h1, you will give a check, you will come back and you will get into a situation like this. You know, you're gonna stay in the corner, white will try to check you and try to set up some sort of a checkmate, but you can defend, and that's what you need to remember. Your bishop generally hangs out on these two diagonals depending on where the rook is. In this case, the rook is on h7. It's threatening a check on h8. So in this case, you need the bishop on this diagonal to go to b8. However, if the rook was all the way over here, just simply shift over to this diagonal and then you can always block on a7. So your main idea with the bishop is to stay around one of these two diagonals and that is going to draw you the game. If the king ever goes to b6 or c7, you can always give a check, just like you see right here. But there's going to be cases where maybe this square is covered and maybe somehow you cannot give a check on e3. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, let's say king b6 and you cannot give a check on e3 for some reason. If the rook is on e7, no problem, you can always block on b8. If the rook goes over here, it's stalemate. If the rook does something else, okay, then you will simply go back and then go to b8, and basically you're just going to be going back and forth, giving some checks and then not allowing your opponent to checkmate you. This is actually the whole technique. It is not as complicated as it might have initially seemed. However, if you get caught in the wrong corner, such as this one right here, black has a dark square bishop and is near the dark square corner, you could very easily lose this game. In this position, after a move like g7, white is simply giving up this pawn. After bishop takes king g6, there's nothing you can do because you're going to get checkmated. If you move the bishop away, then this is a checkmate. If the bishop goes to e5, then this is going to be a double attack. There's gonna be a threat of a checkmate and an attack on the bishop on e5. And if you go to f8, now you're gonna get put in zugzwang because after rook to b8, your only legal move is to move the king because the bishop is pinned. You go king h8 and then after rook to f8, this is checkmate. So don't get caught in the wrong color corner. Let me show you another position, and this position is also a draw despite the fact that white is also up a pawn. The king is in the right color corner. However, in this case, you have to be very precise with the black pieces. You have to play bishop to c2 and cut off this diagonal right here and not allow the pawn to advance, because the threat here is that if the pawn advances, then you can't do much because king h6 is coming. Like, let's say bishop to d3, now king h6, you can no longer capture this pawn and the position is lost because a rook a8 will come, or some check on the diagonal. Even if we defend it right away, there's going to be something that wins here for the white pieces. But going back, if we stop h7 pawn advancement right away, then if we capture and the king goes to h6, this is simply going to be a draw because we can go bishop to g8. Rook a8 ends in a stalemate, and if the rook moves somewhere else, let's say all the way over here, fine, we can also just go back, and this is a typical drawn situation because there's no way to checkmate the black king. The king is in the right color corner. He's in the dark square corner while having a light square bishop. Therefore, this position is also going to be a draw. Okay, now I'm going to discuss possibly the most important concept that we're going to discuss in today's video, and that is that if there are a lot of pawns on the board, that benefits the side that has the rook and the side that is trying to push for a win. However, if there are less pawns on the board, then it's going to benefit the side that has the bishop, the knight, or just the side that is defending in general. So in a position like this is a completely winning position because white will simply first and foremost defend these two pawns, and then white will simply advance his king, and slowly but surely this rook will be able to get in and it will be able to pressure some pawns. That could be with f4, f5 to go after h4, or it can be in any way in general. In a position like this, it is completely winning, but after a move like f4 here, the rook is simply going to get in, and this is a devastating position for the black pieces, and there is absolutely no way to defend it. So let me just go back and show you the beginning position. This is the beginning position. Now, if we change the position a little bit, we remove the pawns over here, this position is harder to win as the white pieces than the previous one because there are less targets for the rook. It is still winning because 4 pawns for each side is a lot of pawns. However, it is getting closer and closer to a draw, and if we go to a position like this, now this position is completely drawn and there is no way to win it. Now, that doesn't mean that the draw is easy for the black pieces. If you're playing this with white, you should still continue to pressure black because it's very easy to make a mistake here with the black pieces, and it is very easy to lose this endgame as the black pieces. So after a couple of moves, white will simply advance up the board, and what I want you to notice is that the pawn on g6 and the bishop on f6 are creating a natural barrier here, and of course if you utilize your pawns as the white pieces, that gets a little bit difficult because you cannot easily trade all the pawns off. If you trade all the pawns off, that is going to be a draw. We know that bishop versus a rook is a draw, although in this case it is a wrong color corner. That is why it's so difficult for the black pieces. However, in a position like this, what black will try to do is not allow the white king to get in, and even if the white king tries to get in from this side, from e6, let's say, it's still not going to matter because there's still a natural blockade being put up by the bishop and the pawn, and also the king as well, because the king is controlling f7, and this position is a draw if you don't allow the king to get in. It's a very difficult draw, however, it is still a draw. So remember, the side that has the rook wants there to be more pawns on the board, preferably on both sides of the board, both king side and queen side. The side that is trying to defend, in this case the bishop, wants less pawns on the board, such as this position right here where it's on the same flank and it's 2 versus 2. So there's less imbalance, and there are also not a lot of pawns on the board. So principle number 2 is going to be to sacrifice the rook for a bishop or a knight. It actually doesn't matter whether there's a bishop or a knight in this case on e6, but you want to sacrifice the rook for either of those two pieces if you're able to get an extra pawn. So in a position like this, the pawns are 2 versus 2. However, white has the opportunity to sacrifice the rook for the bishop and also get the pawn on e6, and this is going to result in a winning king and pawn endgame. And oftentimes you should sacrifice the rook because it makes the game more concrete, and here you can win easily by playing moves like g4 and f5 and then advancing your pawn forward and then winning this position right here. It's very easily winning. Check out my king and pawn endgames video for that, but make sure to sacrifice and exchange if you're able to get an extra pawn and if you're able to go into a winning king and pawn endgame. Okay, now let's briefly take a look at this position right here. White has a rook and black has a bishop and a pawn for that rook. So is this position a win for white, or is this a draw for the black pieces? And the answer is that this position is winning for the white pieces because there are pawns on both sides of the board. I'm gonna bring this detail up one more time because this is very, very important. And in this position, the way you would win this is you would threaten to infiltrate. Let's say black defends with a move like bishop to to e6, and then you need to slowly advance here with your pawns, and after you do that, eventually you're going to be able to create a passed pawn. Let's say on h5, if your opponent didn't capture on g4, in that case you would have done something different. Let's say your opponent moved the king as an example. You create a weakness on h5 which you can target, and then you can go in with king f2, king g3, f4, rook e5. You can target this pawn and you can go into a winning endgame one more time. So this position right here, let me go back, is winning for the white pieces despite the fact that black has an extra pawn. However, if we change the position a little bit and make it this position right here, now this is a draw because pawns are only on one side of the board. We discussed earlier that if pawns are on one side of the board, it could be a draw even if it's the same amount of pawns if the side has the bishop. However, it is a very difficult draw, but in this case it's a bishop and a pawn for a rook. So black has 4 pawns, white has 3 pawns, and this is a much easier endgame to defend than the other one. And if the pawns are only on one side of the board, this is going to be an easier draw for the black pieces. Just like rook versus bishop, rook versus a knight is also a draw, but there are a couple of details that we have to keep in mind. First and foremost, the knight and the king must stay together. If they get separated, black might lose this position, and also try to avoid the edge of the board if you're playing this with the black pieces and if you're trying to draw this position. In rook versus knight endgames, it's better if the king is sort of closer to the middle and also the knight is close to the king. If you get into a situation like this one right here, the knight can easily get trapped and you have to be very careful. Right now this position is white to play, and white can try to trap this knight and not allow it to get close to the king. For example, after a move like rook to b4, you have to be very careful. Let's say knight to d8 is played, but now king to f6 will be played and not allowing the knight to get close to the black king. Let's say knight goes all the way over here. Now we go rook to e4. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to disallow this knight to get closer to this king right here. And the problem here for the black pieces is that there's simply nothing he can do. If you go knight to a5, rook e5 wins the knight. If you go knight to b8, then rook e6 further cuts this knight off. Now this is the only move, and after knight to b8, now the knight is completely stuck on the edge of the board and it will simply be picked up by the white pieces. So make sure that your knight is close to the king. If you're playing the position from the black side, try to get them as close to each other as possible. There's one more case where this position is lost for the side that has the knight, and that is in these sorts of positions, rook versus a pawn. We already talked about this position in my rook versus passed pawn video, but if you're on the edge of the board and you make a knight right here, you're going to get put in zugzwang, and this position is also winning for the side that has the rook, because you're simply in zugzwang. If you go with king f1, rook a1 wins the knight. If you move the knight anywhere, the knight simply gets taken. I cannot make normal arrows. There we go. The knight simply gets taken, and this position is winning for the white pieces. And once again, similarly to the rook versus bishop situation, rook versus knight is also winning for the rook if there are more pawns on the board. So the more pawns that there are on the board, the merrier it is going to be for the white rook. And if we change the position and we have less pawns on the board, it is still winning in this case for the white pieces. However, it gets more and more difficult. Even this position right here, this is winning for the white pieces. If there was a bishop on f6, this would actually be a theoretical draw. However, if we remove one more set of pawns from this position, now this is a draw and black is simply going to hold this game. So make sure to keep as many pawns on the board as possible if you're the side that is playing with the rook. Don't allow your opponent to trade off many pawns, and preferably get a position where there are pawns on both sides of the board. That way you can go rook c1, rook c7 and immediately go after these pawns and try to win them as soon as possible. Even rook d6 or rook b6 works as well. That might even be better actually, but make sure to keep as many pawns on the board as possible. Okay, now let's talk about rook versus two minor pieces, and that would be either two knights, knight and a bishop, or two bishops. So first and foremost, two knights are the easiest thing out of those three for the rook to deal with. Rook especially struggles against the two bishops. Two knights are a bit easier for the rook to deal with, and what really matters in these sorts of positions where there is rook versus two minor pieces is whether a rook is able to target opponent's pawns. In this case, it is very difficult to accomplish that because all of the infiltration squares are covered, and it is very difficult to hit any pawns. It's not possible to attack b7 for this rook right here because you cannot go rook e7, you cannot go rook e8 and then rook b8 in order to hit that pawn. So you can't do much. Therefore, this position is a draw. It might even be practically better for the side that has the two knights. Let me modify the position a little bit now. In this position, white is completely winning. Why? Because after rook to e7, white can easily target this pawn on b7 and black cannot defend it at all. But if we change the position yet again and get this position right here, it goes back to a draw again because this pawn right here can be defended with moves like bishop to e4 check. And you don't even have to go bishop e4 right away. You can wait for the rook to take this pawn, and of course that would be a blunder because bishop e4 would simply be a fork. So rook really struggles against even one bishop, but if we change the position again and make it two bishops, this is even worse for the rook. Rook really struggles against two bishops. Against two knights or knight and a bishop, it's a little bit easier, but against two bishops, it is an absolute nightmare for the rook to deal with the two bishops. There's actually only one line that draws the game here for white, and that is this line right here, rook e8 check and then rook to b8. This is the only line that draws, and even here I would still prefer this position for black because it is practically so difficult to play this position, and you have to play a sequence of only moves as the white pieces, like f3 only move, here b4 only move, otherwise you just lose the game. This is a very difficult position to handle, and rook really struggles against the two bishops. Here we see yet another example of that, but in this case rook cannot even infiltrate because the two bishops are covering the entire e-file, and this is just going to be winning for the two bishops because there's nothing you can do with white. There's literally nothing you can do. There's no way to make any progress. You can try like maybe f3 g4. How are you going to try f3 g4 when the h4 pawn is going to hang? And this is just a very difficult position. If you play a move like b4, okay, a6, and you can try to go with a4, but what black will do is black will just slowly and methodically advance, bring the king, play g5, get some diagonals, and slowly but surely black will win this position. However, if the rook has any targets, and let me show you the last position right here, this is the last one that I'm going to show you. If rook has any possible targets, such as let's say this one right here, the pawn on h5, it is very difficult for black to deal with the rook if that target cannot be defended. So in this position, black has knight and a bishop. However, if we go rook to g8, we are threatening this move, rook to h8, and how does black deal with this? Let's say this move h5, but okay, rook to h8. How do you defend this pawn right here? It is very difficult to accomplish that. If you go knight to g7 to defend this pawn, okay, rook h7, now we kick the knight away, the knight has to move, now we capture the pawn, and with this passed pawn, it makes it even more difficult for black to deal with this situation, and this position is winning for the white pieces. So what really matters in rook versus two minor piece situations is, first of all, which minor piece combination is there, because knight and a bishop is not that dangerous, but two bishops would be extremely dangerous, such as this one right here. And the second detail that really matters is whether the rook is able to target any weaknesses in opponent's position. If both of those conditions are met for the rook, and if both of those conditions work in the rook's advantage, in that case the side that has the rook is going to have a better position. Otherwise, the rook is really going to struggle, especially against the two bishops. So that's going to be it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.